Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. When I moved into the ground floor apartment in Southeast Portland, it was early in the pandemic. The city had gone quiet in that strange, hollow way, like the world had hit pause. I'd lost my job a month earlier, and finding a place on my own had felt like some desperate restart. The complex was older but clean, tucked behind a stretch of maples and narrow residential streets. My unit faced a gravel path that wrapped around the back courtyard, where the dumpsters and bike racks sat. It was cheap, small, and quiet, or at least it seemed that way. The only real noise came from the guy upstairs. Mid-40s, bald, always wearing the same dark hoodie or flannel jacket. I didn't know his name, never saw him during the day. But at night, I'd hear the steady rhythm of his footsteps above me, the pacing back and forth, sometimes for hours. I could tell exactly when he stepped onto the balcony because the wood would creak, and the faint smell of cigarettes drifted down. I'd watch the orange glow of the ember appear, fade, then return again. Ash sometimes fell past my window, leaving faint gray marks on the sill outside. I told myself it was nothing. Everyone had weird habits during lockdown. Maybe he couldn't sleep. Maybe he was one of those restless people who needed to move to think. It wasn't a big deal. I started keeping my blinds closed at night just because the light from my laptop probably drew his eye, but I didn't think much beyond that. In February, Portland was cold and wet. The days blurred together, long stretches of gray sky, rain hissing against the windows. I was half living off coffee and frozen dinners, barely talking to anyone. One night, around 2 in the morning, I woke up without knowing why. There was a sound, and faint, soft like plastic bending or something shifting. Then another, a click. I stayed still, eyes open, listening. It came again. The tiny, deliberate sound of my blinds moving. I turned on my phone's flashlight and aimed it at the window. For a fraction of a second, I saw fingers, pale, adult-sized fingers, slip away from the small gap between the blinds. They vanished so quickly I thought I might have imagined it. Then came the crunch of footsteps retreating on the gravel path outside, uneven and fast, fading into silence. My body wouldn't move. I just sat there in bed, heart hammering so hard it hurt. I kept the light pointed at the blinds for a long time, waiting for something else to happen. It didn't. After maybe 15 minutes, I got up, went to the window, and looked out through the smallest crack I could make. Nothing. Just the courtyard, the faint glow of a streetlight hitting wet leaves. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, when I finally worked up the nerve to check outside, there were muddy footprints in the gravel, clear, heavy ones leading straight up to my window. They stopped there and turned back toward the path. The blinds had small smudges where the fingers must have pressed. I called the landlord, told her what happened. She sounded tired, like I'd interrupted something, and said it was probably just maintenance checking something near the window. When I asked why anyone would do that at 2 a.m., she didn't have much to say. Just told me not to worry, that the complex was secure. I didn't believe her. That day I walked to a hardware store a few blocks away and bought blackout curtains, thick ones that sealed tight against the wall, and a motion light for the outside. I mounted the light above the window and plugged it in through the outlet inside. If anything moved out there again, I'd see it. For a while, nothing happened. I tried to convince myself it had been a one-time thing. Some drunk person or homeless guy cutting through the lot. The pacing upstairs continued, but I ignored it. Weeks passed, and I started sleeping again. Then one night, around midnight, the motion light clicked on. The glow was bright and harsh, cutting through the curtains. It flooded the room in a soft white halo. I froze. The sound of rain was faint outside, but there was something else. Breathing. I pulled the curtain back just enough to peek through. He was standing there. The guy from upstairs. The same bald head, the same dark jacket, just a few feet away, framed in the motion light's glow, staring directly into the window. No expression, no movement, just staring, For several seconds, I couldn't move. I didn't even breathe. Then something in me cracked and I screamed. I didn't even know what I was yelling, just noise, pure panic. He flinched, stepped back, then turned and ran. I heard the gravel scatter under his shoes, the sound fading fast around the corner. I locked the windows, called the police, and waited shaking on the floor until they arrived. When they searched the area, they found fresh prints in the mud outside my window, and under 3 other ground floor windows in the same row. They knocked on his door upstairs. He didn't answer at first, but eventually they got him to open it. They found night vision goggles in his apartment, a pair of gloves, a flashlight with the lens covered in tape to dim it. He didn't resist, just stood there while they handcuffed him. The officers told me later he'd been arrested before, years back, for trespassing and peeping incidents. I learned his name that night when they ran his ID. Something ordinary, forgettable. I won't say it because I don't want to remember it. After they took him, the police stayed to take pictures of the prints and the light setup. The officer asked me how long I'd lived there, if I'd noticed him watching before. I told him about the pacing, the ashes, the sound that night in February. He nodded like he'd heard it all before. For days after, I couldn't relax. I kept checking the motion light, replacing the batteries, testing it even in daylight. I'd wake up at every creak or car passing outside. I stopped sleeping near the window and started keeping a chair wedged against the lock. The landlord apologized once after everything came out, said she had no idea. He was that kind of person, but it felt hollow, like she was saying it because she had to. Eventually, the unit upstairs went vacant. The blinds stayed drawn and no one moved in for months. I'd walk past the courtyard sometimes and look up at that balcony, empty now, with a line of green moss growing along the railing where his cigarette ashes used to fall. I couldn't look at it for long. It made my stomach turn. I moved out that summer. I didn't take much with me, just what fit in my car. I remember loading the last box and looking at that window one more time. It looked so ordinary in the morning light, just glass and cheap white trim, but I could still picture his face behind it. Still picture the way he stood so still, like he was trying to memorize me. My new place is on the 3rd floor now, nowhere near the ground. The windows face a courtyard that's always bright and full of noise. I still keep blackout curtains and I still check the locks twice before bed. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I think about that night, the quiet way he backed away after I screamed. I think about how long he must have been watching before I ever noticed. And I realize that maybe what scared me most wasn't that he was there. It was how close he'd already gotten without me knowing. The power went out on a Friday evening, right as another heavy snowstorm was settling over the town. The lines of the streetlights blinked off one by one, and the neighborhood sank into a deep, quiet kind of darkness that only happens during winter, when even the sound of wind feels muffled by the snow. I remember standing at my window, looking across the street, and seeing nothing but white, except for the faint orange glow from one house, Mr. Hoffman's. He was running a generator, like he always did when the power went out. The noise started that night, a low, rumbling hum that you could feel in your chest if you stood near his fence. It wasn't loud enough to be annoying, but it was constant. Every hour, every minute, day and night, that deep growling sound carried across the snow-covered yards. By the second day, I had gotten used to it. I'd even find myself listening for it while I was boiling water on the gas stove or trying to sleep under extra blankets. It was comforting in a way. The sound meant someone still had power, that life was still happening somewhere on the street. Mr. Hoffman lived alone in that small single-story house at the end of the cul-de-sac. He was in his late 70s, maybe older, with thin gray hair and those cloudy blue eyes that always looked like he was staring past you. He didn't talk much, just waved when he took his trash out or when he was out raking leaves. But everyone in the neighborhood knew he was careful about everything. His house was always perfectly maintained, gutters cleared, walkways shoveled, tools neatly lined up in his shed. He used to be an engineer, so my dad once told me. Everything he did was precise, planned. By the third day, the storm had mostly stopped, but the power still hadn't come back on. The snow in the yards had hardened into a crust, smooth and untouched except for a few tire tracks and footprints from the first day. I was outside, checking on the pipe behind my house to make sure it hadn't frozen, when I noticed something strange. The generator had gone silent. At first, I thought maybe the snow muffled the sound. I stood still for a long time, listening. Nothing. Just the faint whisper of wind against the houses. It was so quiet it made my ears ring. I waited another hour before deciding to walk over. The air was so cold it burned when I breathed. The snow was nearly up to my knees in places, untouched except for the faint path I was making. When I reached his driveway, I saw that no one had been there for days. No tire marks, no footprints. His mailbox was half buried. Every curtain was drawn shut. Even the porch light, which was usually on, was dark. I knocked on the door, waited, then knocked again. No answer. I circled around the side of the house, looking for signs of movement. But the windows were sealed tight, and every single one had thick duct tape along the edges. I checked the back door, it was the same. Even the small vents near the foundation had been taped over. Didn't make sense. That's when I decided to call the sheriff's office. I told them about the generator stopping, about how Mr. Hoffman hadn't been seen since before the storm. They said they'd send someone to check, but with all the downed lines and blocked roads, it took them almost 2 hours to get there. I waited on my porch, watching their headlights crawl slowly through the snow-covered street, until they finally pulled up in front of his house. They knocked like I did. Then louder. After a few minutes, one of them looked back at me, nodded, and went around the side with a flashlight. Another went to the truck and came back with a crowbar. I stood there with my hands in my pockets, the cold seeping through my gloves, as they forced the front door open. When the door cracked open, even from where I was standing, I could smell it. The air that poured out was thick and metallic, like rust and exhaust mixed together. One of the deputies gagged immediately and stepped back, pulling his jacket up over his face. They went inside slowly, calling his name, their voices echoing dully through the still house. After a few minutes, one came back out and told me to stay where I was. I could see the look on his face even from a distance, stiff, pale, the kind of look that tells you something's very wrong. They radioed for more help, and soon another vehicle arrived. It was about half an hour before anyone came back out again. By then I'd gone numb from standing in the cold, but I couldn't make myself leave. I just kept watching that open doorway, waiting. Finally, one of them walked over looking shaken. He didn't say much, just told me that Mr. Hoffman was dead. They found him in the basement near the generator, which he had set up indoors. He'd sealed every possible crack in the house, windows, vents, doors, everything. Carbon monoxide must have filled the place fast once the machine was running. For a moment, I felt sorry for him. It sounded like a stupid mistake, something a person would only do if they were desperate to stay warm. But then the deputy said something that stuck with me. He said they found other things down there. That night, when the sheriff's office finally left, a few of the neighbors came out onto their porches. The power was still out, so everyone was bundled up, talking quietly in the dark. No one really knew what had happened. The official story came later, after they'd been through his house. Apparently, the basement wasn't just where he kept his generator. It was filled with boxes, old dusty boxes stacked from floor to ceiling. Inside them were notebooks, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all identical black covers, lined pages filled front to back with Mr. Hoffman's handwriting. The deputies said each notebook was labeled by year and month. Inside they found lists, rows of names, dates, and times. Not random notes, but exact schedules. They said he had recorded everything about us. What time we left for work, what time we came home, when we went to bed, when our porch lights turned off, when our kids walked to the bus stop, even what time we usually took our trash cans to the curb. Some entries were years old. He'd been keeping track for at least a decade. The notes were unbelievably detailed. One page described a neighbor's argument. Another listed when someone's dog was let out. He even knew the brand of cigarettes a man 3 houses down smoked. and how often he went outside to do it. The sheriff told us that according to some of the last entries, Mr. Hoffman thought he was keeping the neighborhood safe. He believed his notes could prevent something bad from happening. That was how he justified it. To himself, anyway. The part that disturbed me most wasn't even the notes themselves. It was realizing I'd never once seen him writing. His curtains were always drawn, his blinds always closed, but somehow he'd known every detail of our lives. He must have been watching from small cracks or through gaps in the blinds. Maybe when we thought we were alone in our yards or coming home late at night, he was awake, recording the time we unlocked our doors. For days after, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I tried to remember every moment I might have been visible from his house, every time I'd gone outside in my pajamas to grab something from the car, every phone call I'd made on the porch. I imagined him sitting there, quietly writing in one of those notebooks, noting the exact time I stepped out, what I was wearing, what direction I looked. When the county finally towed away his generator and boarded up his house, the noise of it all, the hum that had filled the neighborhood for days, was gone for good. But the silence that followed didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt hollow, wrong. Even after the power came back, no one could sleep right for a while. The glow from his windows was gone, and the house just sat there, empty and sealed, surrounded by perfect snow with no footprints leading to it. Sometimes at night, I'd catch myself listening for that faint rumbling sound again, the one I'd gotten so used to hearing. And every time when I realized it was gone, I'd feel this strange unease settle over me. It wasn't just that Mr. Hoffman had died. It was knowing that for all those years, while we were living our quiet, ordinary lives, making dinner, leaving for work, watching TV, he had been quietly documenting every moment, every movement without any of us noticing. He'd been watching, recording, and preparing for something only he understood. And the worst part is, none of us will ever really know what he was waiting for. It started with small things missing, bills that never arrived, a birthday card my sister swore she sent, a package that tracking said had been delivered but never showed up. At first I thought the mail carrier was just careless. My street was quiet, a short cul-de-sac on the edge of town, with 6 houses spaced out between tall maple trees and cracked sidewalks. Nothing really happened there. The most excitement we ever got was a raccoon knocking over a trash can or a teenager speeding down the hill. So when mail went missing, I figured it was just bad luck. But after a few weeks, it became too frequent to ignore. I stopped getting utility bills. A small box from my cousin went missing. I ordered something online and stayed home all day to make sure I'd catch the delivery. It showed delivered at 3:42 p.m. But when I checked, there was nothing. That was when I started suspecting porch pirates. Everyone had been talking about them lately online. People stealing packages in broad daylight. My porch wasn't even that visible from the street, but I guess it wouldn't be hard for someone to walk up from the sidewalk and take something. I decided to buy one of those cheap motion detecting cameras online. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small white plastic unit with a blinking red light that made it look more serious than it was. I set it above the porch light, angled down toward the steps where the mail carrier usually dropped things off. I tested it by walking up and down a few times to make sure it caught movement. It worked fine. That night, I went to bed thinking that if someone tried anything, I'd finally know. It took only 2 nights. I got an alert on my phone around 10:50 p.m. that there was motion detected. I was half asleep and almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. When I opened the app and watched the clip, I just froze. The figure on the screen wasn't some stranger or thief in a hoodie. It was my neighbor, the older woman who lived directly across the street, Mrs. Langley. She was in her 70s, small and thin, always wearing floral nightgowns and a soft cardigan. Every Christmas she brought me a tin of homemade cookies and sometimes watered my plants when I was away. But in that video, she was walking slowly across the street in the dark, barefoot, wearing a long robe. She moved straight to my porch, bent over and picked up the small stack of mail that had been left earlier that day. Then she turned and walked back toward her house without a word, calm and deliberate, like she'd done it before. I sat there staring at the screen, trying to make sense of it. Told myself maybe she was confused, maybe she thought it was her mail or was just taking it to keep it safe. The next morning I checked my mailbox, completely empty again. I didn't want to believe it was something sinister. She'd always been so kind, always asked about my work, always smiled when she saw me. That afternoon I went over to her house. I could see through the front window that her curtains were half drawn, and the TV was on, playing some old black and white movie. I knocked on the door, and after a few seconds she appeared, her expression blank, almost as if she didn't recognize me. I tried to keep my voice gentle. I told her I'd noticed some of my mail had gone missing, and I just wanted to make sure everything was okay. She stood there silently, staring at me, her lips pressed tight. Then she said something I didn't expect. "They tell me what's in your letters." Her voice was quiet, almost whispering. Before I could ask what she meant, she shut the door hard enough that the glass in the window rattled. I just stood there on her porch, stunned. I walked back to my house with this uneasy feeling building in my chest. That night I left the porch light on and double-checked the camera. The next morning, when I opened my door, I froze. All my missing mail was there. Every envelope torn open, the paper inside soaked and discolored. It looked like someone had poured bleach over everything. The smell hit me before I even stepped outside. The ink had bled into cloudy streaks and some of the envelopes were just pulp. I spent an hour gathering it all into a trash bag, my hands smelling like chemicals even after washing them. There was no note, no sign of anyone, just that ruined pile sitting neatly on the porch. Later that afternoon, a car pulled into her driveway. A man got out, tall, maybe in his 40s, and walked up to my door. He introduced himself as Mrs. Langley's son. His voice was low and heavy, like he'd had this conversation before. He said he was sorry for what had happened. His mother had stopped taking her medication, he explained, and she'd been struggling again. I didn't ask what that meant, but I guessed from his tone it wasn't the first time she'd had episodes. He promised they were moving her into a care home that week, somewhere she could be watched and helped properly. I nodded, told him it was fine, that I understood, even though I didn't really. He looked tired, not embarrassed, just worn down by it all. He thanked me for being patient and left. For a while I didn't think about it much. The mail started coming again, normal as ever. New envelopes, new packages, all untouched. I threw away the damaged ones but kept one envelope, the only one that still had my name visible. The bleach had warped the paper, made the ink smear into ghostly lines, but you could still read my name printed neatly on the front. Sometimes I caught myself staring at it, wondering what she thought she was reading, or what she thought she was protecting herself from. A few weeks later, her son came back. I saw his car parked out front and the door to her house open wide. Movers carried boxes out, furniture wrapped in blankets. I crossed the street and asked how things were going. He said she'd been moved into care, that the house was going to be cleaned and sold. Then he mentioned something that made my skin crawl a little. While cleaning, they found piles of opened mail inside her house. Not just mine, everyone's from the street. Hundreds of envelopes sorted by name. She'd kept them organized in neat stacks labeled with sticky notes. He said mine had the most by far. Whole drawers of them, all opened and carefully refolded. I didn't say much. I just stood there, watching movers carry out an old armchair that I remembered seeing through her front window. The air smelled faintly of bleach even from where I stood. He told me again he was sorry and thanked me for not calling the police when it happened. I told him it was fine, that I was glad she was safe. He nodded and went back inside. That night I sat on my porch for a long time, watching the empty house across the street. The blinds were gone, and through the bare windows I could see the yellow light of a single lamp glowing in the hallway. It felt strange, like something had been taken out of the street that couldn't be replaced. the small town calm replaced with a quiet that didn't feel right anymore. The next morning, the garbage truck came, and I finally threw out the last ruined envelope I'd kept. But I couldn't shake the image of those stacks in her house. How carefully she must have opened each one, read them and put them in their place, or for weeks after. I'd still glance across the street whenever I picked up my mail, half expecting to see her there again, standing by her garden, smiling the way she used to. The house stayed empty for months. A for sale sign went up, then a sold sticker later. New people moved in, a young couple, quiet, polite. Life went back to normal, or at least close to it. But sometimes, even now, I think about what she said that day, the flat, unblinking way she looked at me when she said it. They tell me what's in your letters. I'll never know what she meant or who she thought they were. But every time I open my mailbox and see a new letter with my name printed neatly across it, I still feel the urge to glance across the street, just to make sure no one else is watching. When I first rented the basement studio, I was just happy to have a place of my own. It was small, a little damp, and smelled faintly like concrete dust, but it was cheap and close to work. The landlord, a quiet man in his 50s, handed me the keys and told me the guy next door kept to himself. I remember nodding, not thinking much of it. Most people in that building seemed to keep to themselves. It was an older building, 1970s maybe, split into small studio units, each one tucked along a narrow hallway that always felt colder than it should have been. My unit had one small window near the ceiling that looked out to ground level. I could see shoes passing by sometimes. Inside, the walls were painted a dull cream, uneven in spots where someone had tried to cover cracks. The only furniture I brought was a bed, a desk, and a lamp. The shared wall, mine and the neighbors', was thick concrete, though not thick enough to completely muffle sound. I'd hear things now and then. Dull thuds, the scrape of something heavy being dragged or moved. A faint rhythmic tapping that I assumed was from him working late or maybe exercising. Nothing that felt alarming. The first few weeks passed quietly. I worked long hours and spent most evenings streaming shows or half asleep at my desk. But I started to notice the sounds more at night. The thuds, sometimes soft, sometimes sharp, like something being dropped. Other times, a slow drag across the floor. I figured he worked night shifts or maybe rearranged furniture when he couldn't sleep. A few times I'd knock lightly on the wall out of frustration, just a polite, "Hey, I can hear that," kind of knock. It always went quiet afterward. The smell came first before the flooding. It started as a faint sourness, something metallic and stale, like old pipes. I thought maybe the drain was backing up or a dead mouse had gotten into the vent. I cleaned everything, poured bleach into the sink, opened the small window for airflow, but it kept coming back stronger each day. Then one night, around 3 in the morning, I woke up cold and confused. My feet felt damp. I turned on the lamp and saw a thin stream of water gliding from under the wall, pooling across the floor. It wasn't clear water. It was thick and rusty looking, with a brownish tint that caught the light. The smell hit me almost instantly. Rotten, like metal mixed with spoiled meat. My stomach turned, and I jumped out of bed, standing barefoot in that slimy mess. I tried to trace where it was coming from, crouching down near the baseboard. The flow was steady, oozing through a gap in the shared wall. I grabbed my phone and called maintenance immediately. They told me to shut off my water valve. But when I told them it wasn't from my side, they said they'd send someone out right away. I remember pacing around, trying not to breathe through my nose. The air felt heavy with it, like it clung to my clothes and skin. When maintenance arrived, 2 men in rubber boots started knocking on the neighbor's door. No answer. They knocked louder. Still nothing. One of them looked at me and asked when I'd last seen him. I said I hadn't, not once. Just the sounds through the wall. They exchanged a look and fetched the landlord. After some arguing, the landlord unlocked the door. I stood in the hallway while they went in. The smell that poured out was like nothing I'd ever experienced. One of the maintenance guys gagged. I caught a glimpse inside. The lights were off, the floor was wet, and there was a trail of reddish water stretching toward the hallway. They told me to stay back, and I did. A few minutes later, one of them came out pale and shaking his head. They called the police. It turned out the man next door had been dead for days. They found him in the bathtub, the water left running, overflowing until it spread into my unit. The landlord said it was probably natural causes, maybe a heart attack, but no one knew for sure at that point. I couldn't stop thinking about the sounds I'd been hearing, those thuds and drags. Had they been before he died or after? For the next 2 days, the building was full of people. Police, paramedics, later a cleaning crew. I stayed with a friend because I couldn't handle the smell that lingered. Even after they aired out the place, it clung to everything. When I came back, there were plastic sheets taped along the hallway, warning signs, and a low hum of dehumidifiers running non-stop. I thought that would be the end of it. Just an awful story to tell someday. But the real horror came when the cleaning crews started taking apart the wall. I was in my unit, packing a few things into boxes because I'd already decided to move out, when I heard one of the cleaners call for the supervisor. Curiosity got the better of me and I stepped into the hallway. They were clustered around the wall that separated our units. They'd removed part of the drywall and found several small circular holes drilled through it, each one no bigger than a pencil, running in a vertical line about the height of my bed. I just stared at them. My bed had been against that wall since I moved in. One of the workers said the holes were angled downward, which meant they weren't random. They'd been drilled deliberately to look through from the other side. I remember feeling cold all over, the kind of chill that starts in your spine and spreads out until you can't think straight. When the police came back to inspect, they found a small camera lens hidden behind a piece of furniture in his unit, pointed directly through one of those holes. Behind his dresser, the drywall had been cut away slightly, creating a little hollow where he'd mounted it. I couldn't breathe when they showed me. The lens was small enough to go unnoticed from my side, but once I knew it was there, I felt like every second I'd spent in that room had been stolen. Every time I'd changed clothes, slept, stretched, even just existed, someone had been watching. They said it looked like he'd set up a simple wired camera system. They found a small old laptop on his table, still open, the battery long dead. No one could tell how long he'd been doing it, or if he'd recorded anything. When I asked one of the officers, he just said the files were corrupted from water damage, and I should focus on moving out. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with the light on until morning. Every sound in the pipes, every creak in the floor above made me flinch. The thought that he'd been inches away, maybe sitting in the dark behind that wall, watching me as I slept, it made my skin crawl. I couldn't stay another night. The landlord offered to move me to another unit upstairs, but I didn't want anything to do with that building. I broke the lease, forfeited the deposit, and left within the week. I packed fast, throwing clothes into garbage bags, not caring what I left behind. Even after I moved, I couldn't shake it. For months, I kept checking walls, outlets, smoke detectors, anything that faced my bed. I started sleeping with my back to the wall and covered up mirrors at night. It wasn't fear of ghosts or anything supernatural. It was the simple, unbearable thought of being watched without knowing, of living normally while someone on the other side was recording every small piece of your life. Sometimes, I still think about those faint thuds I used to hear. The ones I thought were furniture moving. Maybe they were. Or maybe it was him, pressing his ear to the wall, shifting his setup, adjusting his view. I'll never know how long he'd been doing it. I'll never know what he saw or what he planned to do next. All I know is that the night the water came through my floor, I thought I was dealing with a plumbing problem. In reality, it was the end of something that had been going on silently for months, something I had lived beside every single day without ever realizing it. I still remember the color of that water, the smell of it, and how it crept across my floor like something alive. I remember thinking I'd seen the worst of it that night. I was wrong. The worst part wasn't what came through the wall, it was what had been watching from behind it. It started with the sound of metal clanking one cold night in early October of 2019. I remember because the air had that sharp, damp smell that comes after a light rain, and the streetlights across the alley gave everything a washed-out orange glow. I was sitting by the kitchen window of my small house in Winnipeg, scrolling on my phone, when I heard the banging. It was coming from Dennis's garage, the one directly behind mine across the narrow back alley. His garage light was on, spilling a pale beam through the gaps in the warped wooden doors. The banging came in steady bursts, like someone driving nails into something hard. Dennis had always been one of those neighbors who took more than he gave. When I first moved into the house in 2017, he'd been friendly enough, middle-aged, a bit overweight, always wearing a greasy ball cap with a faded logo on it. He had a habit of leaning over the fence to chat whenever I was outside, always with a beer in hand. But it didn't take long before I realized every conversation led to him borrowing something. It started small, a wrench, a screwdriver. Then it became bigger things. My ladder disappeared for 3 months once. My extension cord vanished entirely. The last straw was my shovel, a good sturdy one I'd bought that spring. He borrowed it to clear out some dirt in his yard. It never came back. After that, I stopped lending him anything. By the time October rolled around, I had more or less stopped talking to him. He'd still nod at me sometimes, but there was tension. That unspoken understanding that he'd taken advantage, and I'd noticed. So when I heard him working in his garage so late at night, I didn't think much of it. It was typical of him to be tinkering with something at weird hours. He always had a half-finished project, an old snowblower, a broken lawnmower, things he said he'd fix up and sell. I figured he was just at it again, but then I noticed how long it went on. The banging started around midnight and didn't stop until almost 2 in the morning. There was also this occasional scraping sound, metal dragging across concrete. At one point I thought about looking through the window that faced the alley, but I decided not to. I didn't want to get involved. I turned off my light and went to bed. The next morning, I was taking out my garbage when I saw it, my shovel. It was leaning against the short section of chain-link fence at the edge of his property, near the alley gate. The metal spade was coated with wet dirt, clumped thick along the edge. The wooden handle was damp, like it had been left out in the rain. I recognized it instantly because the grip was wrapped in black electrical tape where it had cracked months ago. For a second, I thought about going over and saying something, but I stopped myself. Maybe he'd finally decided to give it back. Maybe he'd just set it there and forgotten again. Still, something about the dirt bothered me. It wasn't the kind of dirt you'd get from planting flowers. It looked darker, heavier, like soil from deep in the ground. The grass near his fence was disturbed too, like someone had walked back and forth a dozen times through mud. A few days later, I noticed a new patch of soil behind his garage, visible from the alley. It was clearly freshly turned, uneven and darker than the rest of his yard. I remember thinking it was odd for him to be doing yard work that late in the season. The rest of his lawn was covered in fallen leaves, but that one area looked freshly dug. I convinced myself he'd buried trash or maybe filled in a hole from one of his projects. It didn't sit right, but I pushed it out of my head. Dennis's garage stayed quiet for a while after that. I didn't see him much either. His truck was usually parked half inside the garage, half out, and once I saw what looked like a big tarp folded near the door. I remember that detail because it was bright blue, and it stood out against everything else. His property always looked dull and gray. Then, one morning a week later, I woke up to flashing lights outside my bedroom window. When I looked out, the alley was filled with RCMP vehicles. 2 cruisers blocked both ends of the alley, and a third one was parked right behind Dennis's house. Officers in dark jackets were stringing up yellow tape around his yard. The whole scene looked surreal, so out of place in that quiet residential area. I went outside, trying not to look too curious, but everyone else in the neighborhood was already out too. People stood on their porches, whispering to each other. I walked up to the edge of the tape where one officer was standing guard. From that angle, I could see that the officers were gathered near the exact same patch of soil behind Dennis's garage. the one that had been freshly turned. They had shovels and they were digging carefully, pulling back layers of earth. The longer it went on, the quieter the crowd became. Eventually, one of the officers called for something over the radio, and then a few others stepped back. A black body bag was brought out, and I remember the way everyone's faces changed when they realized what they were looking at. They zipped it up quickly, but not before I saw part of a work boot sticking out. My stomach dropped. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. For hours, the police worked around the property. They taped off the garage and went inside. I stood there until an officer came to talk to me, asking if I knew Dennis or had seen anything unusual recently. My mind was racing. I told them about the late-night banging, about the shovel, and about how I'd found it against his fence covered in dirt. The officer wrote everything down, then asked if the shovel was mine. I said yes. That's when he asked me to come down to the station to make a full statement. It turned out Dennis had killed his cousin. Over money, of all things. From what the officer said, it wasn't some accident. It had been planned. The cousin had come over that night, probably to confront him about a debt, and it escalated. Dennis had buried him right there behind his garage, using my shovel to cover the grave. The realization hit me harder than anything else. My own shovel, something I'd used to plant a garden, to dig post holes for my fence, had been used to bury a body. In the days that followed, the neighborhood changed. People talked in low voices. Reporters came by, filming the alley and interviewing anyone who'd speak. Dennis was taken away in handcuffs that same day, looking blank and tired. His garage door stayed open for a while after the police left, showing all the junk inside. Tools, boxes, the blue tarp folded in the corner. I remember thinking how ordinary it all looked, like any other messy garage. The RCMP returned my shovel eventually, but I couldn't keep it. Put it in my shed for a few weeks, but every time I saw it leaning there, it made me feel sick. The dirt had been cleaned off, but I couldn't forget what it had been used for. One evening I drove to a nearby landfill and threw it in. I didn't even want to donate it. It felt tainted, like something that didn't belong to me anymore. By spring, I'd had enough. I sold the house and moved to another part of the city. The alley, the garage, even the way the streetlights looked at night. It all reminded me of that winter. I never met whoever bought Dennis's place, but I saw the for sale sign come down months later. Sometimes, when I'm in a hardware store and I pass by the section with garden tools, I see the same model of shovel hanging on the rack, the same wooden handle, the same metal blade. Every time I do, I get that same twist in my stomach. Strange how something so ordinary can become tied to something so dark. It makes you realize how close evil can live. Right across the alley, behind a half-open garage door, using your own tools to cover up what it's done. The shed was the first thing I noticed when I moved into that house. It sat at the very back of Earl's yard, leaning slightly to one side like it was tired of standing. The paint had once been red but had faded to a dull pinkish brown, peeling in long strips that fluttered in the wind. The wood underneath looked swollen and warped, like it had soaked up too many rainy seasons. A rusty padlock hung on the door latch, the kind of heavy old lock you'd see on a storage unit or a gate to something that wasn't supposed to be opened. Earl himself wasn't much different from the shed. Quiet, weathered, closed up. He was an older man, probably in his 70s, with a thin gray beard and clothes that looked like he'd worn them for years. Sometimes I'd see him in his yard, standing near the shed like he was listening for something inside. He'd just stare for a while, then turn and go back into his house without a word. At first, I didn't think much about him. The neighborhood was quiet. Just a row of small houses backed up against a line of woods. You could hear crickets and frogs at night, dogs barking in the distance, the occasional car. Peaceful in a way. But that shed, it always seemed to pull my eyes back to it. The first time I heard the noise, it was just after midnight. I was sitting by my window, scrolling through my phone when I caught it. A slow dragging sound. Something heavy shifting. Then a quick scrape, like metal against wood. It came from Earl's yard. I leaned closer to the window, but his backyard was dark except for a bit of moonlight reflecting off the shed roof. The noise came again, slower this time, followed by a kind of dull thud. Then silence. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or stray cat. Earl didn't seem the type to keep pets, but maybe one got inside somehow. Still, the sound had a strange rhythm to it, like someone dragging something across the floor and then dropping it. Over the next few nights, it kept happening. Not every night, but often enough that I started paying attention. Sometimes the noise lasted only a minute, sometimes longer. Always that scraping, shifting sound, always from inside the shed. By late June, the air had turned thick and hot. You could smell the dirt after dark, the heat still rising off the ground. I noticed Earl less and less. His curtains stayed drawn and his mailbox filled up. I thought about checking on him, but I didn't know him well enough to just knock. He was one of those people who made you feel like you were intruding, even when you said hello. Then in early July, the smell started. It was faint at first, like old garbage. I thought maybe one of the neighborhood cats had died under a porch somewhere. But within a few days, it got stronger. Rotten, sour, with a metallic edge that caught in your throat. When the wind blew from the right direction, it rolled straight through my open windows. I saw Earl once more around that time. He was out by the shed in the middle of the afternoon, sweating through his shirt, standing completely still. I called over to ask if everything was all right, and he waved weakly. Said something about a raccoon dying under the floorboards, that he'd deal with it when it cooled down. His voice was flat, tired, like someone who hadn't slept in days. That was the last time I saw him. After that, his house went quiet. No light in the windows, no movement, nothing. The smell kept getting worse. It hung in the air so thick that I could taste it sometimes. A few neighbors started talking about it, wondering if Earl had gone out of town or maybe to the hospital. Nobody really knew him well enough to find out. A few weeks passed. I noticed his lawn starting to die in patches, the grass yellowing in the heat. Mail piled up at his door. The shed just sat there silent now. I hadn't heard any noise from it since the day I saw him. Then one morning, a silver car pulled up outside his house. A woman got out, mid-30s maybe, wearing jeans and a t-shirt. She stood on his porch for a long time, knocking, calling his name. I could hear her faintly from where I was. She tried the door, then walked around to the back. She stayed there a while before coming back out front and making a phone call. She looked upset. Within an hour, a police cruiser showed up. 2 officers talked with her for a bit, then went around back. I stepped out onto my porch. From there, I could see the shed again. The padlock still hung on it, but one of the officers was pointing at it while the other spoke into his radio. I couldn't help watching. The woman, his niece I later learned, stood with her hands on her head, pacing. The officers got a crowbar from their trunk, went around the side, and started prying at the lock. It took a few hits before it snapped open. When the door swung out, both men stepped back fast. One of them covered his nose. Even from where I stood, I could smell it hit the air, thick and putrid, like something that had been shut away too long. The niece started crying. They didn't let anyone get close. More cars came. An ambulance, another cruiser, a van with investigators. They set up tape around the yard. I watched the officers go in and out of the shed, their faces pale and tight. Later that evening, when most of the commotion had settled and the coroner's van drove off, I finally overheard one of the remaining officers talking to a neighbor across the street. Earl had been dead for weeks. They found him sitting on a chair inside the shed, shotgun across his lap. He'd shot himself sometime after the 4th of July. The smell, the noises, everything. It all made sense then. But what really stuck with everyone was what he'd done to the inside of the shed. The walls were completely covered in old newspapers and sheets of tin foil, stapled up in overlapping layers. Every inch of it from the floor to the rafters, like he was trying to block something out. They said he'd written a note directly on the wood in black marker. Big uneven letters. Can't stand the noise anymore. The cop said there was no sign of anyone else being there. No animals. Nothing to explain what he might have heard. Just him, The shotgun, the note, and that strange insulation of paper and foil. That night after everyone was gone, I sat out on my porch and looked at the shed. The door was still open a crack, the police tape fluttering in the warm breeze. I could see the glint of the tinfoil inside when the porch light hit it. The smell was still there, faint but sharp. I wondered how long he'd been sitting in there before anyone noticed. How many nights I'd been awake hearing those noises, thinking it was just an animal while he was losing his mind inside that little wooden box. Over the next few days, people came and took things from the house, some family, maybe cleaners. They hauled out furniture, bags of clothes, boxes of junk. Eventually, the shed door was shut again, but they didn't bother locking it. Now, months later, the grass around it is still dead. The wood's darker, maybe from the rain. Sometimes when it's quiet at night, I catch myself looking over at it again, half expecting to hear that dragging sound start up. But it never does. There's nothing left to make noise in there anymore. Only the shed, slumped at the edge of the yard, keeping whatever drove him to madness sealed in its silence. When I moved into that little rental house in Brisbane in 2020, I liked that it was tucked back on a quiet street. It was small, just one bedroom, an open kitchen, and a narrow backyard with a tall wooden fence that made it feel private. I worked from home then, so most days I'd sit out on the patio with my laptop, barefoot in the grass, listening to the breeze move through the palm trees that leaned over from the neighbor's yard. It was peaceful except for one thing: the dog next door. My neighbor, a guy named Scott, had a big German shepherd that barked all day. The sound would bounce off the fence, deep and harsh, sometimes so sudden that I'd flinch when it started up. Still, I didn't want trouble, so I tried to ignore it. Scott himself was quiet. I saw him a few times, usually late in the day when I was watering the plants. He'd be out by his shed, wearing the same work clothes, not looking up when I waved. Just a nod. Sometimes not even that. A few weeks after I'd settled in, I noticed a small hole near the bottom of the fence behind my outdoor chair. It was round, perfectly clean, no splintering around it, about the size of a coin. I crouched down and peered through, but saw only the base of the neighbor's shed and the shadow of the dog pacing around. I figured the dog must have done it somehow, maybe digging or chewing. The hole looked too precise, but I didn't think much about it. I found a cork from an old bottle and pushed it in to block it. The next morning it was back, but slightly higher. The new hole, same clean edges, same size. The cork I'd used before was lying in the grass beside it. I remember staring at it for a while, confused. I plugged it again, this time using a small piece of wood. The following morning there was another one. A bit further down the fence, it became routine after that. Every night before bed, I'd check the fence and cover whatever new hole appeared. Every morning there'd be another. Always perfectly round, never splintered. I started to feel uneasy, but I still told myself it had to be the dog somehow. Maybe scratching or pushing something through. I even checked the yard for chew marks or damage, but the grass was untouched. It didn't make sense. A few nights later, I was sitting on the patio with the lights off, just scrolling through my phone. The air was still, and I could hear insects humming by the back fence. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a small glint, a faint reflection. It came from one of the holes, a soft shimmer like glass catching light. It vanished when I looked straight at it. I thought maybe it was dew on the wood, but that small flicker stuck in my mind, so I decided I'd wait up one night and see what was really going. Once I turned off all the lights inside the house so the backyard was pitch black except for a dim light from a nearby street lamp. Spilling over the top of the fence, I sat by the window where I could see the fence clearly without being seen myself. I waited. It was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that makes every small noise feel sharp. Crickets. A car passing a few streets away. Then around 11:30 I saw it. A faint glow coming from one of the holes. A white circle of light flickering slightly. At first I thought maybe it was a reflection again, but then it moved. Closer. The shape of the light changed as if someone was adjusting something behind the fence. I could see the edge of a hand's shadow, That's when I realized what it was. A phone. Someone was holding a phone flashlight against the hole, pointing it inward. And then I heard breathing. Slow, steady, close enough that I could tell it wasn't the dog. I froze. My heart was hammering, my throat dry. I didn't move for a few seconds, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then I grabbed a metal broom handle leaning near the patio door and slammed it against the fence as hard as I could. The noise was sharp enough to echo. I shouted without thinking, my voice cracking from how tense I was. The light vanished instantly. I heard a quick shuffle, the sound of shoes scraping dirt, then the dog barking wildly on the other side. I stood there for a while, staring at the fence, breathing hard. Nothing else moved. After a minute, I went inside and locked every door and window. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I checked the fence again in daylight. The hole was still there, but now there were two more. Higher up, one at about chest level and another near the ground again. I could see the fine dust from drilling still clinging to the edges of the wood. The realization hit me fully then. These weren't dog holes. They were made deliberately. I went straight to the police station and filed a report. They told me to take photos of everything and not to block the holes until they'd had a look. An officer came by later that afternoon. He walked the whole fence line slowly, shining his own flashlight at each spot. I followed him, watching as he found more and more of them. Not just the ones I'd seen. Some were hidden behind overgrown grass, others near the corners where I rarely went. By the end, he counted more than 10. He crouched down at one of them and pulled out something small with gloved hands. It looked like a thin black cable, a fiber optic camera. There were more of them, tiny ones pushed just far enough through the wood to see into my yard. I remember feeling my stomach drop. I'd been sitting out there almost every day, reading, eating, working on my laptop, completely unaware that someone was recording me. The officer knocked on Scott's door that evening. I didn't hear what was said, but I saw Scott standing in the doorway, arms crossed, face blank. The officer left after about 20 minutes. When he came back over, he told me Scott had denied everything, said the holes must have already been there, but they'd be taking the cameras as evidence and opening an investigation. For the next few days, I avoided the backyard. Every time I looked out there, I imagined him standing just behind the fence, watching. The dog kept barking at random hours, which only made it worse. I started keeping my blinds closed even during the day. I could barely sleep. Every sound outside felt suspicious. Footsteps, scraping, rustling. A week later, the police called. They told me the footage from the cameras was being processed, and that they'd found timestamps on the devices dating back months. He'd been watching and recording since long before I noticed the first hole. They didn't tell me what exactly was on the footage, just that it was enough to charge him. But Scott never showed up to the court hearing. He moved out before it even began. The house next door sat empty for a while, grass growing tall, the shed still standing behind that fence. I stayed there for a few more months, but I could never relax again. I replaced parts of the fence myself, sealed every gap, even installed motion lights. Still, every creak at night made me tense. The sense of privacy I'd liked about that place was gone. I kept thinking about how easy it had been. Just a few holes, some cheap cameras, and patience. Eventually, I moved. Different suburb, different street, no shared fences. I don't even like sitting in backyards anymore. Sometimes, though, when I walk past certain houses and see those tall wooden fences, I catch myself staring at them too long, looking for small round holes near the bottom, wondering if anyone else has noticed them yet. When my wife gave birth, everything in our small apartment changed. The quiet space that used to belong to just the two of us filled with the sounds of soft crying, lullabies, and the hum of a baby monitor sitting on the nightstand beside our bed. Those first few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and early mornings. Every creak of the floor, every car door outside felt amplified in the dark. We were exhausted, but happy in that fragile, uncertain way new parents are. Our upstairs neighbor, Marla, had been one of the first to knock on our door after we brought the baby home. She was a quiet woman in her 60s, small-framed with pale skin and gray hair always tied neatly into a bun. She lived alone and rarely had visitors. I'd seen her before in the hallway, carrying groceries in reusable bags, always smiling politely but never lingering long enough for small talk. That day she carried a small wrapped package, a handmade blanket, soft yellow with a crocheted edge. She said she wanted to help if we ever needed anything, that she loved babies but never had any of her own. I thanked her and she smiled again a little too long before heading back upstairs. At first I thought nothing of it. Marla was just another kind neighbor trying to be part of the moment. But the nights grew longer and our exhaustion deepened. Around 3 a.m., our baby monitor became our lifeline. I'd wake to the faint crackle of static, check the tiny glowing screen, and watch our daughter's chest rise and fall in the dim nightlight glow. It became routine. The quiet hum of the machine was oddly comforting in the dark. Then, one night, something strange happened. It was around 3:15 in the morning. My wife was asleep beside me, breathing shallowly, and the monitor suddenly buzzed with static. Not the usual background hum. This was louder, sharp, like someone flicking through channels on an old television. I blinked awake and looked at the small screen. For a moment it wasn't our nursery. Instead, the image showed a different room. Dark, lit only by what looked like moonlight coming through half-drawn curtains. The wallpaper was old-fashioned, floral, faded with peeling corners. There was a bed against the far wall, a shape under the blanket that didn't move. I could make out a dresser, something glinting faintly on top. Maybe a glass or a picture frame. I stared, confused, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then, just as quickly, the feed flickered and returned to our baby's crib, still and silent except for her slow breathing. I told myself it was interference. Maybe one of the neighbors had a baby monitor on the same frequency. I turned it off and on again and the feed came back normal. My pulse slowed eventually and I tried to sleep, though it took hours before I did. It happened again 2 nights later. Same time, around 3 a.m. I wasn't even fully asleep when I heard the buzz. This time, the image that came up looked like the same room, but darker. No visible movement, just that still shape on the bed. It lasted only a few seconds before snapping back to our nursery. I sat up and stared at the monitor for a long time, waiting for it to happen again, but it didn't. By the end of the week, I'd seen that other room 3 times. Always briefly, always between 3 and 3:30 in the morning. I started keeping the monitor on the nightstand but left the screen off, telling myself I wouldn't look unless I heard something. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know whose room that was. Marla's apartment was directly above ours. It made sense. If her monitor or camera was interfering, it could easily be hers. The wallpaper I saw looked like something that would fit her apartment too. She was older, lived alone, and from what I'd glimpsed through her open door once, her place had that kind of old, dated charm to it. Lace curtains, dim lighting, floral furniture. That Sunday morning, after another strange flicker on the monitor the night before, I decided to go upstairs. I figured I'd mention it gently. Maybe we could change frequencies, or she might not even know it was happening. My wife was feeding the baby when I told her, and she just nodded sleepily, barely listening. When I climbed the stairs to Marla's floor, the hallway smelled faintly of dust and something sour. The carpet was old, patterned, the kind that holds on to decades of wear. Her door, apartment 4B, was cracked open just slightly. I thought maybe she was airing it out or expecting a package. I knocked gently on the frame, then again a bit louder. No answer. I said her name softly. Nothing. When I pushed the door a little, it swung open easily. The smell hit me immediately. It was sharp and heavy, the kind that sinks into your throat. Rot mixed with something sweet and chemical, like spoiled fruit. I covered my nose instinctively and stepped inside, calling her name again even though I already knew something was wrong. The apartment was quiet, the curtains drawn halfway. It looked exactly like the room I'd seen on the monitor. The wallpaper, the bed, the dresser, all of it. I stood frozen for a moment, realizing that what I'd been seeing wasn't some random signal. It was her bedroom, Marla was there on the bed. She was lying on her side, fully dressed in a long nightgown. Her gray hair spread out across the pillow. Her skin looked grayish, sunken. There was no movement, no sound except for the faint hum of a fan in the corner. She'd been dead for days. I could tell from the stillness, the smell, the way everything felt heavy and wrong in the room. I didn't go closer right away. I just stood there, breathing through my sleeve, trying to figure out what to do. I glanced toward her nightstand, maybe out of instinct, and that's when I saw it. A baby monitor receiver, small and white, identical to ours. The power light was still blinking. I stepped closer then, carefully, and saw that it was tuned to our exact model and frequency. The little green light pulsed faintly in the dark. Next to it there was a folded piece of paper, an envelope that had been opened but never mailed. I didn't touch it. My mind was racing. She must have been listening in on us, maybe even watching if she had a camera linked. I didn't know if she meant harm or if it was just loneliness. Maybe she liked hearing the sounds of a baby in the night. Maybe it comforted her. I backed out slowly, heart pounding, and called the police from the hallway. They arrived quickly, a small group of officers and an EMT. I watched from our doorway downstairs as they went up, listened to their quiet voices, the static of their radios, the muffled movements. They brought her out under a sheet after an hour. Later, the officers came by to talk to me and my wife. They said it looked like natural causes, maybe a stroke or heart failure. She'd probably been dead for 3 or 4 days before anyone found her. They mentioned she'd had several electronic devices running, including a monitor that was still on when they entered. I didn't say much. I just nodded. That night, I turned off our baby monitor for the first time since our daughter was born. The silence felt strange, like something vital was missing. The house seemed too still. I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, imagining the soft pulse of that green light upstairs, blinking away in the dark while she lay there. The next morning, I threw our monitor in the trash. My wife asked why, but I didn't explain. I just said it stopped working. For weeks after, I couldn't walk past the stairs without thinking of her. The smell, the wallpaper, the bed, the way her apartment looked exactly like what I'd seen through that screen. I kept wondering how long she'd been watching or listening, and whether, during those sleepless nights, when the monitor flickered to life and I thought I was just seeing interference, she'd been lying there already, gone, while her receiver still blinked faintly in the dark, tuned to us.